Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. This is State and Local Government, and I'm Professor Greenawalt. Um, we want to examine the issues of political culture and political socialization today. So let's move ahead with those. We find that probably the greatest political theorist of the 20th century, James Q. Wilson, and we'll be using lots of his material throughout this course in this semester. He gives us a very good definition of what political culture is. James Q. Wilson says that political culture is, quote, a broadly shared set of ways, of thinking, of thinking about how politics and government ought to be carried out. So, a broadly shared set of ways of thinking about how politics and government ought to be carried out. In other words, it consists of our fundamental assumptions about how the political process really needs to work. Um, we find that some folks that some of you might be familiar with if you're taking comparative government, comparative politics, might be familiar with the book some years ago. The original book was published in 1966 by Gabriel Almond and Bingham Powell, and it was entitled Comparative Politics. I know that many professors continue to use that book in its most up-to-date edition to examine the issue of comparative politics. Well, Gabriel Almond and Bingham Powell have their own definition of political culture that's well worth taking a look at and considering. They define political culture as a pattern of individual attitudes and orientations, a pattern of individual attitudes and orientations toward politics among the members of a political system. So, a pattern of individual attitudes and orientations towards politics among the members of a political system. And they say that such individual orientations would include things like individual orientations would include things such as the cognitive, the affective, and the evaluative are three different orientations that we could have. Now, what do they mean? A cognitive orientation is what we know about politics and government. We know it or we don't know it. Cognitive orientation would be, do you know how many counties there are in Pennsylvania? There's 67 counties in Pennsylvania. There's 67 counties in Florida. This is something that you either know or you don't. You know, and I expect you to remember that fact, by the way. 67 counties in Pennsylvania. I also expect you to remember how many seats are there in the Pennsylvania Senate. There are 50 Senate seats in Pennsylvania. You should memorize that. You'd want to know how many seats there are in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. How many do you think? Well, it's 203, the second largest state house in the United States of America. Well, let's take a look at these. The cognitive orientation we've talked about is one's knowledge of politics and government. Then there's the affective orientation. The affective orientation is how we feel about something. Do we love our political system? Do we reject it? Are we alienated by it? These are our feelings of attachment or involvement or rejection from the political system. And then we have the evaluative orientation. And the evaluative orientation are judgments and opinions about politics. Judgments and opinions about politics. Okay? So, let's go on for a minute. And once we have defined political culture, now we want to take a look at how we measure political culture. What is political culture? How do we measure it? Well, we find that there's really two main ways to measure political culture. One is through public opinion polls and surveys. And of course, one of the most reputable and one of the earliest polls about public opinion was the Gallup poll put together by George Gallup. And on your PowerPoints, that I've asked you to use to follow along with these lectures. There's a picture of George Gallup, who was the originator of the Gallup poll, and you get a little look at him. But another way to determine what political culture is, other than public opinion surveys, would just be through observation. There are some individuals who possess keen senses of observation that many of us do not have. People like Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote one of the best books, maybe the best book ever on American political culture, called Democracy in America. Democracy in America. He wrote it in 1835, and we find that even though it came out in 1835, it still may be the best book on American political culture. Find that he and a colleague came from France to the United States in 1822, I think, 22, 21, 22. And once he was so excited about being in America, he said, I really can't just do my job. His job was to learn about penal reform, learn about prison reform. He and his colleague had won a commission from the French government to come and study American prisons and see what they were doing, the French prisons weren't doing, so that there'd be a better outcome for the prisoner. Well, Alexis de Tocqueville and his friend won this competition, and they've arrived. But Alexis de Tocqueville now wants to see America and not see the inside of prisons. So he asked his friend, he said, I will give you almost all my money if you go ahead and you visit all these places, get all the notes. When we go back to France, I'll help you write the report. Well, his friend accepted, and so Alexis de Tocqueville was off to the races. He was off to read. He was off to look at the country from top to bottom and to give us that beautiful book, Democracy in America. Well, so this is Alexis de Tocqueville, and we find that he kept a record of all his travels around America. At this point, America is really restricted to the area east of the Appalachians and a little bit just west. But he went everywhere in America. In 1821, 1822, returned to France, and then finally wrote the book. In 1835, it was issued, and it became an immediate smash hit. Okay, so that's Alexis de Tocqueville. Okay. We find that just about every type of people have their own political culture. We find that countries have their own political culture, but there are groups of people that have their own political culture. States have their own political culture. Ethnic groups have their own political culture. And it's up to you to observe and see what the political culture of your group is like. We have a number of people that continue to write about political culture. Daniel Alazar was one of the most famous. He wrote one of the most famous books on this subject, American Federalism, A View from the States. American Federalism, A View from the States. This is a classic study of American political culture. He breaks American political culture into three types: moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic. Moralistic are all the many of the states along the Canadian border, or that are north of the Mason-Dixon line, and states that are moralistic view politics and government as the means to achieve their collective goal. Okay, so moralistic individuals, people that possess a moralistic political culture, believe that politics and government can be watched, and you can figure out what type of political culture we have in America. So Daniel Alazar, moralistic And then individualistic are the people in the middle of the country. Pennsylvania was included in this. Individualistic people view politics and government as another way to achieve political goals. So people that are here for are in, well, let me start again. People that are in Pennsylvania, people in the middle of the country, possess an individualistic political culture, and they view, again, politics and government as another way to achieve their individual goals. Lastly, we have traditionalistic. Traditionalistic states are primarily found in the South. They view politics and government as dominated by the elites. Dominated by the elites. Okay. Okay, so far we covered what is political culture, we covered how we measure political culture, and now we are talking about types of political culture. And Daniel Alazar said that there was moralistic political culture in America, those states that are closest to the Canadian border, where they view politics and government as the way to achieve collective good. And then we have the individualistic states, and these are ones in which people view politics and government as another way to achieve their own individual goals. And lastly, we have traditionalistic, and this views politics and government as dominated by elites, and those are primarily found just in the Deep South. Okay? Well, there's a picture in the PowerPoints of Daniel Alazar as well, and there's a map of the United States with the purple-blue states as being moralistic, the yellow states, such as Pennsylvania, as being individualistic, and then the red states as being traditionalistic, the red states. Okay. Well, the American political culture is unique. Most political cultures are indeed unique. There's something that separates them from every other. Well, we found Alexis de Tocqueville was a very good observer, and he had a very clear, crystal clear idea of what America was, what it was all about, and how it went to war. You find that Alexis de Tocqueville believed, when they talk about the uniqueness of political culture, Alexis de Tocqueville believed that neither the laws and the Constitution or the resources of a country could explain the political culture. He thought you need a little bit more than that. You find that certainly American political culture is unique. We find that after the Second World War, there were some countries that tried to have American political culture by simply adopting our Constitution and hoping that they would have the same type of political culture, such as Argentina. and that didn't work very well for them. What is American political culture? What does it consist of? Let's take a look. What is American political culture? First of all, it's a belief in the equality of opportunity. Belief in the equality of opportunity. Secondly, it's a belief in the rule of law. A belief in the rule of law. Thirdly, it's a belief in individualism. A belief in individualism. And fourthly, it's you end up engaging in a lot of civic duty. Civic duty. So American political culture consists of a belief in the equality of opportunity, a belief in the rule of law, a belief in individualism, and a belief in the importance of civic duty. Okay, so that's American political culture. Well, if we have political culture, if we have political culture that's been tried and true in a country for a while, why do we have political conflict? Why do we have political conflict if we agree on all those values that I just mentioned a moment ago? If we all agree on equality of opportunity, rule of law, individualism, and civic duty, why would we need anything else? Well, this is the classic case of we agree on the ends, but we don't agree on the means on how to achieve the ends. So we agree on the ends, but not necessarily on how we would. We agree on the ends, but we don't agree on how to get there. Okay, well, we find that when we look at this institution of democracy in particular, we look at the American crosses and so forth that are in the different European military cemeteries, we find that okay, well, let's pick up on democracy. We find that American political culture is not the only political culture that can support democracy. There's some people that believe that only America's political culture is the one that can support democracy. Well, there are other states, other countries that have different political cultures, and they support democracy as well, and they do it just fine. For example, the United Kingdom, for example, Canada, are good examples of other countries that have very similar political cultures, but they don't support democracy in the same way we do. They have different types of democracy. Well, let's take a look for a moment. United Kingdom, Canada, Sweden are just a small sample of other countries that have a democracy, but they don't necessarily need to rely on frozen instructions found in a freezer somewhere to figure out how to have democracy. There are lots of other democratic states that have democracy. They have a different political culture. Again, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, for example, all are different. Well, what's the slogan of American political culture? The slogan of American political culture, if we had one, would be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we find that the three men who were most responsible for the American Declaration of Independence were, of course, Thomas Jefferson and, of course, his colleague Thomas Jeff. I'm sorry, people who was. I'm sorry. Let me start again. People who were most responsible for these slogan of American political culture, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is, of course, Jefferson. And Jefferson wrote this with the help of Benjamin Franklin and Roger Sherman. So we find that when he is asked to go back today, we find that everyone is working to try to come to an agreement so the baseball season can go on. We look at the slogan of Canada. The slogan of Canadian political culture is peace, order, and good government. Peace, order, and good government. Very different than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Peace, order, and good government. Very, very different. So Canada can support democracy, but it's a very different country than ours. What are the sources of American political culture? Well, you find that they're really fivefold. Sources of American political culture would include, number one, an anti-colonial revolution. Number two, Protestantism. Okay, we are going to take a look at the sources of American political culture. The sources of American political culture are, number one, an anti-colonial revolution. We fought the British and we won for our liberty and for our independence. Protestantism is another source of American political culture, particularly the work ethic that came with it, Protestantism. Thirdly is religious diversity. We find that that was very important in developing our country early on. We find that number four is egalitarianism, the egalitarian family structure. We find that in America we tend to have a family structure where the husband and wife are much more equal than they would be in Japanese society. So, again, the sources of American political culture, the anti-colonial revolution, Protestantism, and then religious diversity. Religious diversity, when the primarily Protestants came to the United States searching for the freedom to worship in the manner that they wished. But you find that they were very good at tolerating other religions as well. So we find that religious diversity is a big source of American political culture. Fourthly is the egalitarian family structure, where the husband and wife are much more equal to one another than would be true in many other cultures. And then lastly, the frontier experience, such as many of you had if you go out with your parents into the woods on canoe trips or outward bound trips, something like that. So these are all sources of the American political culture. The anti-colonial revolution, Protestantism, religious diversity, the egalitarian family structure, and the frontier experience. Okay, those are sources of American political culture. Let's go on. Let's go on to the topic of political socialization. We find that political socialization is the process by which a political culture is established. In the textbook and in your notes, on your PowerPoints, political socialization is defined by the process by which political cultures are established, changed, and maintained. So political socialization is the process by which political cultures are established, maintained, and changed. Okay. How does political socialization operate? There's two main theories that help us explain how political um, political culture may work. One is through systems theory, the other is hegemonic theory. Systems theory or hegemonic theory. Systems theory was put forth by David Easton. Systems theory was put forth by David Easton and Jack Daniels. David Easton and Jack Daniels. Here we find that the systems theory says political orientations are passed from an older generation to a younger generation. So that's why many of us carry around our flash drives, even though we're not going into the classroom, because we're prepared at all moments to help our children if they need help with our subject, for example. So systems theory is one way to explain where political socialization, how political socialization operates. Essentially, you're saying with systems theory that a older generation passes things to a younger generation. Systems theory. Another theory is systems theory. System or hegemonic theory. Hegemonic theory is one in which you have political socialization developing between a dominant ruling class and a dominated or ruled class. The second theory on the explanation of how political culture works. Okay? And how political socialization works. Okay, what are the agents of political socialization? We know what it is, but how does it work? Well, it works through the family. It works through mass media. It works through peers. It works through school. It works through your faith community. All right. Well, lastly, we want to look at, the agents of political socialization. What are some of the things that can pass political socialization from one person to the other? The agents of political socialization that can create political culture and hand it down would be things such as the family would be a great agent of political socialization. Family, number one. Number two would be the mass media. Number three would be peers. Number four would be school. Number five would be faith communities. Number six would be unexplored employment opportunity. Okay, what are the agents of political socialization? The agents of political socialization that we know of are first and foremost the family. The family is the most important agent of political socialization. The family, of course, the mass media. It's hard to ignore the mass media these days, isn't it? Mass media, number three, would be peers or your friends, another source of knowledge about politics and government, knowledge about how you think it should work. So the family, the mass media, the peers, school, number four, another source of information about your political culture. Number five would be employment experiences. Have you gotten to employment experiences? Have you had full weeks of work? And if so, how many weeks in a row? So agents of political socialization, again, can include family, mass media, peers, school, your faith community, and number five would be your employment experiences. Your employment experiences. If you've always had a job when you needed one, that's great. If you didn't have one when you needed one, that wouldn't be so good. And number seven, prior experiences with the government. Prior experiences with the government. If you worked with the government before, and they were nice to you, chances are you'll like them better and give them a whirl. So, prior experiences with government, another agent of political socialization. Um, let's go on and look at political socialization and support. We find that if we look at political socialization and how it works, Talcott Parsons, of course, is one of the greatest sociologists of the 20th century. He believes that every new generation is, quote, like a, quote, horde of barbarians, unquote, invading the civilized world. He says socialization will calm down or civilize these barbarians. He says that essentially that there are two types of support for a political system within our parameters. There is specific support and there is diffuse support. Specific support is allegiance that we give to a political system because the system delivers what we want. So since the system delivers what you want, you'll give it specific support. If the system is giving you not what you want, but something that isn't so bad, you might give it diffuse support. Diffuse support is to give political options to Okay, well, we said that Talcott Parsons is saying when we look at political socialization and support that each new generation is like a horde of barbarians invading the civilized world. And socialization civilizes these barbarians. There's two types of support for a political system. There's specific support, supporting the system because it gives us what we want, or diffuse support, and that's the support we give to a political system even if we're not getting what we want. Now, obviously, diffuse support, that allegiance that gives people the allegiance to the game that they're involved with, regardless what happens, that may not work very well. But diffuse support is the glue that holds our political system together. Diffuse support is the glue that holds our political system together. Well, you find that David Easton and Jack Dennis have looked at the establishment of diffuse support, and they're trying to figure out how diffuse support emerges. The support we have for a government, even though we're not getting what we want, how does that come about? Well, he thinks it comes about through a four-point process: politicization, personalization, idealization, and Okay, well, let's turn again to Jack Dennis and David Easton. There's a four-part process that occurs during childhood that establishes diffuse support, and it's politicization, personalization, idealization, and institutionalization. What are they? Politicization is when we are aware for the first time that there's an authority greater than mom or dad. Personalization is when we associate that authority with a figurehead. Normally it's the president, but it might be, in your case or my case, it might be a policeman who pulled your parents over. And you're looking at, oh, all of a sudden my parents are very deferential and they're very respectful. Obviously, that man must have something on them. He must outrank them in some way, shape, or form. And they are being very cooperative with him. So we find that Yes, yes. So, politicization is becoming aware that there's an authority figure greater than mom or dad. Personalization is associating that authority that's greater than mom or dad with a person. Generally, we associate it with the president, but in some instances, maybe Mayor Chicago's Mayor Daley Chicago. You might have a knowledge more of Mayor Daley. Someone that grew up with Rudy Giuliani in New York City would be maybe thinking that diffuse support would be run by the mayor. So we associate that with a figure. Third is idealization. We begin to look upon that person as nurturing and beneficial to us. And fifth is institutionalization, and that's when we need a little bit of extra help. And you need to call in some folks to help you go from day to day. Well, the last topic that we want to talk about is political tolerance. And we find that uh, political tolerance is very important. It's very important for the functioning of democracy. Without political tolerance, we can't have democracy. Find that what does political tolerance consist of? It's just allowing others to speak freely, to publish freely, and to peacefully demonstrate. To speak freely, publish freely, and allow everyone the right to freely protest. We find that without the political tolerance, it's impossible to have democracy in any form that we know of it. So, we find that generally what tends to increase a society's level of political tolerance, what tends to increase a society's level of political tolerance is pure and simply education. So the more education that your population has, the better off you're going to generally be. So let's go to the conclusion. We find that American political culture contributes to both consensus and conflict. It contributes to consensus by accepting electoral decisions, by the absence of mass-based revolutionary parties, and by the strong support for the constitutional system. That's how our political culture supports. That is how our political culture supports consensus. Our political culture also contributes to conflict. Well, how does it contribute to conflict? It contributes to conflict by this emphasis on individual rights, that everybody wants to talk about their rights. Our political culture contributes to conflict through a lack of deference to government officials. We don't respect them and show them respect in some instances. And lastly, our political culture contributes to conflict by the willingness to resist government policies, So this is how political culture in America both contributes to consensus and to conflict. We'll be back with the next topic right after this.